The ink was barely dry on the military intelligence report that would save the British fleet. The Duke threw it on the mahogany desk, his eyes alight with rare respect. "Brilliant," he declared, tapping the heavy parchment. "A masterpiece of strategy. Truly, this is a man's job. Women simply lack the cold rationality for such logistics." He didn't look at the quiet, ink-stained girl standing by the tea tray, which was a pity, because she was the one who wrote it. The gaslight in the boarding house parlor always flickered at 10 minutes past midnight, a dying yellow pulse that made the shadows in the room stretch and contract like breathing lungs. Daisy Moore pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until bursts of static color bloomed behind her eyelids. Her neck was a column of stiff, burning pain. She lowered her hands and picked up the steel-nibbed pen again. The ink smelled of iron, wet dust, and sour apples. It had stained the calluses on her middle finger a permanent bruised purple. Across the cramped room, her brother Philip coughed. It was a wet, rattling sound that seemed to scrape against the peeling floral wallpaper. He was huddled beneath 2 woolen blankets, yet he shivered, his thin chest heaving. Philip held the title of junior logistics clerk at the Ministry of Naval Affairs. He collected the 3-shilling-a-week salary. He wore the brass-buttoned coat. But Daisy did the work. She dipped her pen, careful not to let the nib scrape the bottom of the glass well. She had to finish this. The report on Baltic maritime attrition and coal supply lines. It was 80 pages of dense, suffocating arithmetic, geopolitical posturing, and brutal risk assessment. If the British fleet was to blockade the Russian ports without starving their own steamships of coal, they needed a relay system. A system Daisy had spent the last 3 weeks mapping out on the floor of this freezing room, using stolen ministry maps and a ruler she'd bought from a pawn shop. "B," Philip rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "Is it done?" "Nearly," she lied, her voice dropping into the flat, exhausted monotone she reserved for the late hours. She didn't look at him. If she looked at him, she would see the sunken hollows of his cheeks and feel the terrifying, icy grip of panic in her stomach. The rent was due on Tuesday. The apothecary needed paying for Philip's tinctures. She could not afford panic. She could only afford arithmetic. "They need it by morning," Philip whimpered, coughing again into a blood-flecked handkerchief. "Lord Harrington said the Duke is coming from Whitehall. If it's not on his desk—" "It will be on his desk, Tom. Go to sleep." She turned back to the ledger. She wrote with a meticulous masculine script she had spent months perfecting, sharper angles, heavier downstrokes, stripped of the looping, delicate flourishes taught at the girls' academy she had briefly attended before their father's death. Every word was an act of forgery. Every number was a piece of her own mind, boxed up and sold under her brother's name. By 4 in the morning, the damp cold of the London fog had seeped through the window panes, settling into her bones. Her fingers were so stiff she had to pry them off the pen. She blew gently on the final page, the blue ink shimmering wetly in the dim light before settling into a dull, matte navy. She bound the pages with heavy twine, pulling the knot so tight the rough fibers bit into her raw skin. She felt no triumphant swell in her chest, no heroic satisfaction. She only felt empty, her brain scraped clean, a hollow ache residing behind her forehead. 5 hours later, the rain was coming down in sharp diagonal sheets. The walk to the ministry was a 1.5 miles of dodging, slop-filled gutters and horse dung. Daisy walked slightly behind Philip, carrying his heavy leather satchel because his breathing was too shallow to manage the weight. Her boots leaked. She could feel the icy, grimy water seeping through the cracked leather sole, soaking her woolen stocking, turning her toes numb. The hem of her wool skirt, already heavy and smelling faintly of wet dog, dragged against the cobblestones. They entered the Ministry of Naval Affairs through the servants' and clerks' entrance in the alley. The air inside hit her like a physical blow. It was stiflingly warm, thick with the smells of damp wool coats, stale pipe tobacco, and the ozone tang of 60 typewriters clacking in unison. "I'll take it," Philip said, his voice returning to a pale imitation of authority now that they were within the marbled halls. He snatched the bound report from her hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. The resentment Daisy felt wasn't a roaring fire. It was a slow, familiar drip of acid in her gut. She was used to it. "I'll be in the typist's pool," Daisy said, keeping her eyes lowered as a senior clerk brushed past them. "Don't stammer when you hand it to Harrington, Tom. Just give it to him and leave." Philip nodded nervously, adjusting his collar, and disappeared up the grand sweeping staircase toward the mahogany-paneled offices of the upper brass. Daisy turned and walked down the narrow, uncarpeted hallway to the basement. The typist's pool was a long, low-ceilinged room packed with desks and women in drab gray and brown dresses. The noise was deafening, a relentless, mechanical locust swarm of metal keys striking paper. Daisy took her seat at the very back, near the hissing steam radiator that smelled vaguely of burnt hair. She pulled a stack of routine dictation toward her, meaningless memos about uniform brass polish and requisition orders for hardtack. Mindless work. Women's work. She fed a blank sheet into the roller of her Underwood typewriter, her wet boots pooling dirty water on the floorboards, and began to type. But her mind was upstairs, sitting on a desk, wrapped in twine. Gabriel Croft, the Duke of Whitmore, did not look like a man who belonged behind a desk. He moved with the restless, contained energy of a cavalry officer trapped in a parlor. He smelled of rain, expensive cigars, and the faint metallic scent of nervous sweat that clung to the politicians he spent his mornings arguing with. He threw open the door to the clerk's staging room, a transitional space between the basement typing pools and the upper offices, where the senior secretaries sorted the daily chaos. Daisy was kneeling by a lower filing cabinet, her arms full of misfiled dockyard receipts. She froze at the sound of the heavy door slamming against the wall. "Harrington!" Gabriel barked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that cut through the ambient murmur of the room. He strode in, his heavy wool overcoat dripping water onto the polished floorboards. In his large, scarred hand, a souvenir from a skirmish in the Hindu Kush, he held a thick stack of pages bound in twine. Daisy recognized the knot. Her breath hitched. Lord Harrington, a portly man with a florid face and a perpetually greasy forehead, scrambled out of his adjoining office. "Your Grace, I wasn't expecting you down here." "I don't care what you were expecting," Gabriel interrupted, slapping the report against his thigh. "Who wrote this?" Harrington blinked, his eyes darting to the blue ink. "Ah, the Baltic Logistics Assessment. That would be young Moore, Your Grace, Philip Moore, a junior clerk." Gabriel stared at the report, then at Harrington. He ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving it standing on end. For a moment, the room was terrifyingly quiet. The scratching of pens at the nearby desks ceased. Daisy knelt by the cabinet, her heart suddenly hammering a frantic, bird-like rhythm against her ribs. He found an error, she thought, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of her neck. "I carried a zero wrong. I miscalculated the tonnage. He's going to fire Philip." "Promote him," Gabriel said. The silence in the room stretched, thin and brittle. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace?" Harrington stammered. "Are you deaf, man? Promote him." Gabriel walked toward a large sorting table, dropping the report onto it with a heavy thud. "I have spent the last 3 weeks sitting in Parliament listening to gray-haired admirals tell me that supplying the fleet past Denmark is an impossibility. They gave me poetry about the freezing seas. They gave me sentiment." He tapped the cover page with a heavy index finger. "This," Gabriel continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "is not sentiment. This is cold, brutal, glorious arithmetic. The supply chain relay on page 42 alone is a stroke of tactical brilliance. It accounts for coal spoilage, boiler degradation, and Russian tariff zones without wasting a single word. It is ruthless." Daisy realized she was holding her breath. Her chest ached. A bizarre alien warmth started to bloom in her stomach. Brilliant. He had called her work brilliant. The Duke of Whitmore, The most notoriously demanding military mind in the War Office was standing 10 feet away, praising the hours she had spent shivering in the dark. A tiny, foolish smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "I will have a desk set up for more on the 4th floor by tomorrow," Gabriel ordered, turning to leave. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. His eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, the color of a winter sea, swept past the filing cabinets, past the desks of the female clerks and secretaries. His gaze slid right over Daisy, registering her as nothing more than a piece of office furniture, a girl in a damp brown skirt kneeling on the floor. "It's refreshing, Harrington," Gabriel said, buttoning his coat, "to finally read something in this building that isn't bogged down in timidity." He gestured vaguely toward the typing pool door. "Keep the girls to their dictation and their tea-making. We need minds that can endure the ugliness of war without flinching. This," he tapped the report one last time, "this is a man's job. Tell Moore I want to see him in my office at noon tomorrow. We have a fleet to move." Gabriel turned and strode out of the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The silence shattered into a low buzz of whispers. Daisy stayed on the floor. The foolish, fragile warmth in her stomach curdled instantly, turning into a heavy block of ice. A man's job. She looked down at her hands. The purple ink stain on her middle finger throbbed. She felt a sudden, humiliating sting at the back of her eyes, but she blinked it away fiercely. She wasn't sad. Sadness was a soft emotion. What she felt was a deep, cynical exhaustion. She wasn't angry that he thought women were incapable. She had lived in this world long enough to expect that. What made her jaw clench, what made her stomach twist with a sickening, raw kind of shame, was that for a split second she had actually wanted his validation. She had wanted him to know. She gripped the edges of the misfiled dockyard receipt so tightly the stiff paper sliced a tiny, stinging paper cut into the webbing of her thumb. A drop of blood welled up, bright and jarring against the dullness of the room. She stared at it, wiped it carelessly on her dark skirt, and stood up. There was no room for pride when rent was due. Philip was going to the 4th floor, which meant she was going to have to work twice as hard to keep him there. Gabriel's office on the 4th floor did not smell of damp wool or burnt hair. It smelled of lemon oil, old leather, and power. The walls were lined with towering bookshelves, and a massive map of Europe was spread across a sprawling mahogany table, held down by heavy brass compasses and crystal tumblers. Philip looked like he was walking to the gallows. He was sweating profusely, a sheen of clammy moisture on his pale forehead. He clutched his bowler hat to his chest like a shield. Behind him, carrying a steno pad and 3 sharpened pencils, walked Daisy. She had insisted. When Philip came home trembling the night before, hyperventilating at the prospect of answering the Duke's questions, Daisy realized with cold clarity that her brother would hang himself within 5 minutes. She had drafted a quiet, polite lie for Harrington. "Mr. Moore's throat is terribly raw today, sir. He requested I attend to take his dictation and assist with retrieving his figures." Gabriel was leaning over the map, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the pale, jagged edge of a scar running up his left wrist. He didn't look up when they entered. "Moore!" Gabriel barked. "Shut the door. Come look at this." Philip jumped, hastily pushing the heavy door shut. He shuffled toward the table, his knees practically knocking together. Daisy stood a few paces behind him, pressing her back against the cool plaster of the wall, making herself as small and invisible as possible. The migraine she had been fighting for 2 days was beating a steady, rhythmic drum under her right temple. "I've spent the night reviewing your secondary proposal for the Prussian railway bypass," Gabriel said, tracing a finger along a red line on the map. "It's aggressive. I like aggressive. But there's a hole in your logic, Moore, and I need you to patch it before I present this to the Admiralty Board at 3 o'clock. Philip swallowed audibly. A hole, Your Grace?" Gabriel finally looked up. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Philip's trembling frame. A flicker of disappointment, sharp and fleeting, crossed his rugged features. Yes, a hole. Page 57. Gabriel tapped the map. You propose routing the reserve coal through the Königsberg railhead, but you've budgeted for standard gauge freight cars. The Prussians operate on a narrow gauge line east of the Vistula River. The cargo would have to be offloaded and reloaded, adding 4 days to the transit. 4 days means the fleet sits dead in the water off Helsinki. Explain to me how you account for the delay. Philip opened his mouth. A pathetic squeaking sound came out. He closed it. He looked frantically at the map, then at his shoes, then, desperately, over his shoulder at Daisy. Gabriel's gaze followed Philip's. He looked at Daisy standing against the wall. His expression was flat, unreadable, irritated by the distraction. Who is she? My sister, Your Grace, Philip stammered. Daisy, she assists me with my typing. My throat is quite raw today. I don't care if your throat is bleeding more. I asked you a logistical question, Gabriel snapped, his patience evaporating. How do you account for the narrow gauge delay in Königsberg? Philip swayed slightly. The silence stretched. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like hammer blows to Daisy's aching head. She watched her brother drowning. She felt a wave of profound, weary pity for him, mixed with an intense, suffocating panic. If Philip failed here, the promotion was gone. The 3 extra shillings a week were gone. The apothecary would cut off Philip's medicine. But beneath the panic, something else stirred. A vicious, protective instinct over the work itself. Her work. Gabriel was staring at her numbers, her agonizingly constructed puzzle, and he was calling it flawed. She couldn't stand it. The cargo doesn't go on the rails at Königsberg, Your Grace. The words slipped out of her mouth before her brain could authorize them. Her voice was quiet, lacking the booming resonance of the men who usually occupied this room, but it cut through the silence like a dropped glass. Gabriel froze. He slowly lifted his head, his gray eyes locking onto her. The intensity of his stare was physical, heavy, and pinning. What did you say? Daisy felt her cheeks flood with hot, stinging color. Her instinct was to apologize, to shrink back against the wall, to blame it on a misread note. But she looked at the map. She saw the red line. She remembered the cramp in her hand at 3 a.m. when she had drawn the very same line on her stolen copy. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at his hands on the table. I said the cargo doesn't go on the rails, Your Grace, Daisy repeated, her voice shaking only slightly. She stepped forward, drawn by the gravity of the map. If you look at the addendum on page 58, which Mr. Moore dictated to me. She lied smoothly, giving Philip a momentary shield. The Prussian narrow-gauge line is irrelevant. The coal is barged down the Pregel River straight to the deep-water port at Pillau. The cost of the river barges is offset by the lack of railway tariffs. It bypasses the offloading delay entirely. Gabriel stared at her. He didn't blink. The silence in the room became thick, charged with a strange, crackling electricity that made the hairs on Daisy's arms stand up. He looked down at the report on his desk. He flipped to page 58. His eyes scanned the dense blue ink text. He read it once. He read it twice. He looked back up at her. The irritation was gone from his face. In its place was a sharp, calculating focus that made Daisy feel entirely exposed. He wasn't looking at a typist anymore. The river freezes in late November, Gabriel said, his voice lower now, challenging, a predator testing the fence. Barges can't move through ice. Which is why the tonnage schedule on page 60 requires the stockpiling of 90,000 tons at Pillau by October 15th, Daisy countered, the numbers tumbling from her lips with the ease of a native language. Her headache was forgotten. The room faded away. There was only the problem and the solution. It creates a buffer sufficient to last through the deep freeze until the icebreakers from Danzig can clear a channel in March. She finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. She expected to see anger at her insubordination. Instead, Gabriel Croft was looking at her with the exact same expression he had worn the day before when he had slapped the report down on the table and called it brilliant. Only this time, he wasn't looking at a piece of paper. He was looking at her. "Who calculated the icebreaker fuel expenditure?" Gabriel asked, his voice deathly quiet. He stepped around the edge of the mahogany table, closing the distance between them. Mr. Moore did," Daisy said, her voice faltering as the sheer size of the man became apparent. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the faint silver of a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "I simply copied the figures." "Did you?" Gabriel murmured, stopping 3 feet away from her. He looked at Philip, who was visibly shaking, practically vibrating with terror. Then Gabriel looked back at Daisy. His gaze dropped to her hands, which were clutched tightly around her steno pad. He reached out. Daisy flinched, a raw, imperfect reaction, pulling her hands back a fraction of an inch. But Gabriel didn't touch her. He gently took the top pencil from her white-knuckled grip. He looked at the pencil, then at her right hand, specifically at the deep, permanent, bruised purple ink stain on the callus of her middle finger, the exact shade of the blue ink in the report. Gabriel's jaw tightened. A muscle leaped in his cheek. He looked from her stained finger up to her wide, tired, defiant eyes. A dozen realizations seemed to crash behind his gray eyes in the span of a single heartbeat. The brilliant logistics, the man's job, the terrified clerk, the quiet girl who knew the freezing point of the Preagle River. "Miss Moore," the Duke of Whitmore said, his voice entirely stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced by a low, vibrating intensity. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your brother's dictation." Philip began to cough. It wasn't a polite throat-clearing sound. It was a violent, tearing spasm that originated deep in the ruined bottom of his lungs, hacking into the quiet of the Duke's office like an axe hitting wet wood. Philip doubled over, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany map table. He pulled the blood-spotted handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his mouth, his shoulders heaving. The terrifying tension in the room snapped. Daisy moved on instinct, stepping past Gabriel without a second thought. She grabbed her brother's arm, her fingers digging into his thin bicep, holding him upright as the fit racked his fragile frame. She could feel the heat radiating through his cheap wool coat, the terrifying, familiar rattle of fluid in his chest. Gabriel watched them. He didn't offer a glass of water. He didn't offer a chair. He simply stood with the stolen pencil in his hand, his gray eyes tracking the brutal reality of a consumptive clerk and the sister who held him together. When the coughing finally subsided into a wet, whistling wheeze, Philip leaned heavily against Daisy, his face the color of dirty chalk. "Get out," Gabriel said. The words were low, devoid of anger, but carrying an absolute crushing authority. Philip flinched. He looked up, his eyes wide and panicked, the handkerchief trembling against his chin. "Your Grace, I—" "Not you, Miss Moore," Gabriel interrupted, his gaze shifting from the brother to the sister. "You stay." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through Daisy's veins. She tightened her grip on Philip's arm. "My brother is unwell, Your Grace. He needs to sit down. He needs to wait in the hall," Gabriel said smoothly. He walked behind his desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair, the leather creaking loudly in the tense air. "The corridor has a bench. Go, Mr. Moore. Shut the door. Or Philip looked at Daisy, his eyes begging her to fix this, to weave another lie, to somehow salvage the 3 shillings a week. But Daisy had nothing left. The ink stain on her finger throbbed. The gig was up. She let go of Philip's arm. "Go sit down, Tom," she muttered, her voice entirely flat. Philip stumbled backward, grabbing his bowler hat, and practically fled the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut, with a sound of finality that echoed like a vault ceiling. Daisy stood alone in the center of the vast, expensive rug. The smell of lemon oil and cigar smoke suddenly felt suffocating. She kept her chin level, but her hands were shaking. She folded them tightly over the steno pad pressed to her stomach. Gabriel didn't speak immediately. He picked up the Baltic report. He thumbed the thick, rough edge of the 80 pages. "Where did you learn to calculate maritime drift variables, Miss Moore?" "I don't know what you mean, Your Grace," she lied, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. Gabriel tossed the report onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, uncompromising thud. "Stop it! It is exhausting, and I am already late for a meeting. We both know you wrote it. The callus on your finger matches the pen pressure of the downstrokes. The ink is a cheap iron gall mix, the sort they issue to the basement typists, not the iron blue imported ink Harrington keeps for the senior clerks. And your brother just nearly died trying to answer a basic question about his own supposedly brilliant addendum." Daisy stared at the brass inkwell on his desk. She felt a profound, heavy exhaustion settle into her bones. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the night drained away, leaving her hollow. There was no point in fighting the current anymore. "The public library," Daisy said, her voice dropping its polite, deferential register. It came out rough, tired. "I stole an expired borrower's card from a dead neighbor. I read the Admiralty's unclassified maritime logs from the Crimean War." Gabriel leaned back, lacing his large hands together. "You taught yourself advanced logistical mathematics by reading 10-year-old shipping logs." "Numbers do not change their nature just because the dates do, Your Grace. Distance, weight, and drag are constants." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes hardened into something cynical and sharp. "Are you going to fire him?" "He lied to a peer of the realm and committed fraud against the crown. Firing him is the least of what I could do." "Then do it," she snapped, a sudden irrational anger flaring in her chest. She stepped closer to the desk, her knuckles white around her notepad. "Ruin us and get it over with. Have him thrown in Newgate. Have me thrown out into the alley. But don't sit there and play with us like a cat with a half-dead mouse. You have your confession. What more do you want?" Gabriel didn't blink at her outburst. A faint, almost imperceptible line of tension eased around his mouth. He looked at her not with pity, which she would have hated, nor with outrage, which she expected. He looked at her with a terrifying, calculating respect. "I want the fleet supplied," Gabriel said evenly. He stood up, walking around the desk to stand leaning against the front of it, crossing his arms. He was far too close. Daisy could see the weave of his worsted wool vest, could smell the faint scent of rain still clinging to him. "The men in this building are terrified of failure," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping. "They pad their estimates. They cower behind protocol. They write reports entirely designed to protect their own careers. I don't give a damn about protocol. I give a damn about moving 70,000 tons of coal across a hostile sea before the ice sets in." He reached out and tapped the cover of the report. "This mind," he said, looking at her, "is exactly what I need. But it is trapped in the body of a basement typist, in a ministry that would rather burn to the ground than take strategic advice from a woman." Daisy swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "What are you saying?" "I am saying, Miss Moore, that your brother is going to get his promotion. He will be given a desk on the 4th floor. He will attend the meetings, he will nod, and he will take the notes." Gabriel pushed off the desk, towering over her. "But you are going to be reassigned to my personal staff under the guise of archiving my private correspondence. You will sit in the adjoining room, and you will do the work. You will route my ships. You will calculate my coal." Daisy stared at him, her mind scrambling to process the sheer audacity of the lie he was proposing. You would commit fraud against your own ministry?" Gabriel's mouth twisted into a humorless smile. "I will do whatever it takes to win a war, Miss Moore. The question is, will you do whatever it takes to pay your rent?" Daisy looked at the harsh, unyielding lines of his face. She thought of Philip, coughing blood into a rag. She thought of the freezing room at the boarding house. She thought of the sheer, terrifying thrill she had felt when he had called her work brilliant. "Yes," she said. The word was barely a whisper, but it felt like signing a pact with the devil. Gabriel nodded once. "Good. We start with the Baltic grain routes tomorrow at 6 in the morning. Don't be late." The archive room attached to Gabriel's office was a glorified closet. It smelled intensely of binding glue, decaying paper, and dust that had been undisturbed since the previous decade. There was no window. The only light came from a single hissing gas lamp bolted to the peeling plaster wall and a narrow transom window above the connecting door to Gabriel's main office. Daisy had been living in this closet for 3 weeks. Her fingernails were permanently stained with chalk dust. A massive slate board, scrounged from a defunct naval academy, now dominated the back wall. It was covered in a chaotic, sprawling web of shipping lanes, tonnage estimates, and weather variables, all written in Daisy's sharp masculine script. She stood before it, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, a rag in one hand and a piece of white chalk in the other. Her back ached with a dull, throbbing persistence. It was 8 o'clock at night. Below them, the ministry was dark and empty. "You're wrong about the draft of the merchant vessels out of Liverpool." Gabriel's voice floated through the open connecting door. Daisy closed her eyes, letting her head drop forward until her forehead rested against the cold slate of the blackboard. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting chalk dust. "I am not wrong, Your Grace," she called back, her voice raspy. Heavy footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor, and Gabriel filled the doorway. He had discarded his jacket hours ago. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his cravat loosened, revealing the strong, corded lines of his throat. The ever-present cigar clamped between his teeth glowed orange in the dim light. He looked exhausted, brutal, and entirely in his element. "The registry says they draw 22 feet fully loaded," Gabriel argued, stepping into the cramped archive room. His broad shoulders seemed to take up all the breathable air. "The sandbar at the mouth of the Elbe sits at 20 feet at low tide. They will run aground." "The registry is outdated," Daisy countered, turning around to face him. She didn't shrink back from his imposing presence anymore. The sheer volume of the work had burned away her initial intimidation. "I spoke to a dockmaster down in Wapping yesterday during my lunch hour. The new iron-hulled steamers they're requisitioning from the Cunard line have a wider beam. They displace the water differently. They only draw 19 feet. They can clear the sandbar." Gabriel paused. He took the cigar from his mouth, a plume of gray smoke curling into the stagnant air of the closet. He stared at her, his eyes tracing the smudge of chalk across her cheek, the messy falling strands of dark hair that had escaped her severe bun. "You went to Wapping," he said slowly. "To the docks. Alone." "It's where the ships are, Your Grace," Daisy replied flatly, turning back to the board to underline a column of figures. "The files in this building are written by men who haven't seen salt water in a decade. If you want accurate displacement, you ask the men hauling the cargo." "Wapping is a slum, Daisy. It's crawling with cutthroats and drunken sailors. You have no business being down there." The use of her Christian name, a slip he had been making more frequently in the late, exhausting hours, sent a strange, unwanted jolt down her spine. She ignored it, gripping the chalk tighter. "My business is getting your coal to the Baltic," she said sharply. "You told me to patch the holes in the supply line. I patched them." Gabriel took a step closer. The smell of his expensive tobacco mixed heavily with the scent of her cheap lye-based soap. The contrast was dizzying. "I told you to run the numbers. I didn't tell you to risk your neck in the dockyards." "Why do you care?" Daisy snapped, turning on him. Her exhaustion was making her raw, stripping away the careful, cynical shell she usually wore. "You wanted a mind that didn't flinch at the ugliness of war. Well, the docks are ugly, but they gave me the answer. We can route the iron hulls through the Elbe and save 6 days. Are you going to use the route or not?" Gabriel looked down at her. He was close enough that she could see the distinct rings of darker gray in his irises, the slight, uneven stubble on his jawline. The tension in the tiny room suddenly shifted, warping from professional friction into something entirely different, something dangerous and electric. He wasn't looking at her like a clerk. He wasn't looking at her like a convenient secret machine for his logistics. He was looking at her with a fierce, quiet intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I'll use the route," Gabriel said softly, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. He reached out. Daisy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But he didn't touch her face. Instead, his large, rough hand gently caught the edge of her sleeve, where it had begun to unroll from her elbow. With agonizing slowness, his knuckles brushing against the sensitive skin of her inner forearm, he folded the cheap wool back up, securing it. The touch burned. It was a terrifyingly intimate gesture in a room buried in naval secrets and dust. "But if you ever go to Wapping alone again," Gabriel murmured, his gaze holding hers captive, "I will assign your brother to counting hardtack in the Shetland Islands. Do you understand me?" Daisy couldn't speak. She could only nod, her throat tight, trapped in the crushing gravity of the Duke of Whitmore, realizing with a sinking, terrifying certainty that she was no longer just fighting for her rent. She was fighting a losing battle against the man himself. By August, the archive room was no longer a closet. It was a kiln. The single gas lamp cooked the stagnant air, baking the smell of old binding glue and Daisy's own nervous sweat into the peeling wallpaper. Her corset felt like a cage of hot iron against her ribs. She had unbuttoned the high collar of her blouse, a scandalous allowance she only permitted because the door was locked. On the other side of the plaster wall, the Admiralty board was shouting. The muffled voices sounded like the barking of large, panicked dogs. They had been in Gabriel's office for 4 hours. The Russian Navy had sunk the HMS Vindicator off the coast of Riga, taking 4,000 tons of reserve coal to the bottom of the sea. The supply line was broken. Panic was bleeding through the floorboards. Daisy knelt on the hardwood, staring at the gap beneath the connecting door. 2 sharp raps sounded against the baseboard. Gabriel's signal. A moment later, a heavy piece of cream vellum slid under the crack. Daisy snatched it. Gabriel's handwriting was an aggressive, slanted scrawl, written in haste. "Vindicator gone. Admirals want to pull the blockade back to Denmark. If we retreat, we lose the Baltic. How do we replace the tonnage? You have 5 minutes." Daisy closed her eyes. Her brain, already exhausted, spun up like a heavy flywheel. She didn't have paper large enough to map the diversion. She dropped the vellum, grabbed her nub of white chalk, and crawled to the center of the room. She began to write directly onto the dark, dust-caked floorboards. She drew the coastline of Prussia in a sweeping, jagged arc across the wood. She factored the speed of the Scottish freighters currently sitting idle at Dogger Bank. Distance, 800 nautical miles. Speed, 9 knots. Boiler consumption, 12 tons a day. Her chalk snapped in half under the pressure of her grip. She ignored it, using the broken piece, her knuckles scraping against the rough grain of the wood. Math poured out of her, ruthless and beautiful, stripping away the tragedy of the sunken ship and leaving only the cold reality of time and weight. She crawled back to the door, grabbed Gabriel's note, and flipped it over. She wrote, "Do not retreat. Divert the Scottish commercial freighters at Dogger Bank. Requisition them under the Crown Defence Act. They can reach the fleet in 4 days. It will cost the Treasury a fortune in merchant compensation, but it saves the blockade." She slid the vellum back under the door. For 20 minutes, the shouting next door escalated, then abruptly ceased. The heavy oak door of Gabriel's office opened and closed as the admirals filed out. A moment later, the connecting door to the archive room unlocked. Philip stumbled in. He looked like a corpse dredged from the Thames. His collar was soaked with sweat, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He collapsed against the filing cabinet, sliding down until he hit the floor, his knees pulled to his chest. He dragged a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "They asked me," Philip whispered, his voice cracking. "Admiral Croft asked me to explain the merchant compensation laws. I didn't know them, B. I stood there. I opened my mouth and nothing came out." Daisy wiped her chalk-covered hands on her dark skirt. She felt a surge of pity, quickly swallowed by a darker, uglier exhaustion. What did the Duke say? He spoke over me, Philip said bitterly. He quoted the Defense Act himself. He covered for me. Again. Philip looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears of absolute humiliation. I can't do this anymore. Every day I walk into that room waiting for the noose to snap tight. I'm a ghost in my own clothes. They look at me, and they see your brain. I hate it. I hate you for being so clever. The words hit Daisy like a slap. She stared at her brother, taking in his sunken cheeks and the expensive woolen suit bought with the blood of her labor. It was a vicious, human contradiction. He needed her to survive, and he despised her for it. If you hate it, Tom, then quit, she said softly, the harshness of the truth offering no comfort. Go back to the basement. We can starve honestly. Philip put his head between his knees and began to weep, a pathetic heaving sound. Get out, Moore. Gabriel stood in the doorway. He had stripped off his jacket and waistcoat entirely. His white shirt clung to his shoulders, damp with sweat. He looked at the weeping clerk with a mixture of disgust and profound weariness. Go home. Do not come back until Monday. Philip scrambled to his feet, keeping his eyes averted, and fled the room, leaving the door ajar. Gabriel slowly stepped into the archive room. He closed the door behind him, turning the brass lock with a heavy click. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet. He didn't look at Daisy immediately. He looked down at the floor. The entire center of the room was covered in her frantic, sprawling chalk calculations. It looked like the schematic of a mad woman. Gabriel sank down. The Duke of Whitmore, a man who terrified generals and dined with royalty, dropped to his knees on the dirty floorboards of a supply closet. He traced a finger over the chalk outline of the Prussian coast. They took the Scottish freighters, he said quietly, his voice raspy from hours of yelling. We hold the line. Daisy stood by the slate board, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of her unbuttoned collar, of the sweat dampening her temples, of the sheer, crushing proximity of the man kneeling on her floor. Gabriel looked up at her. The harsh arrogance that usually armored him was entirely gone, burned away by the crisis. His gray eyes were bloodshot, tracking the smudge of white chalk across her chin, the messy tangle of her dark hair. You wrote that on the floor in 3 minutes, he murmured, rising slowly to his feet. He stepped over the calculations, moving toward her. You saved the British fleet with a broken piece of chalk and a stolen mind. It was just arithmetic, Your Grace, Daisy said, taking a half step back until her shoulders hit the cold slate of the blackboard. Stop calling me that, Gabriel said. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. The smell of his skin, salt, expensive soap, and exhaustion overwhelmed her senses. Not in this room. In this room there is no Duke. There is only the war, and you, and me. He raised a hand and gently, almost hesitantly, brushed the chalk dust from her chin with his thumb. His touch was calloused and warm. Daisy's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. The friction of his thumb against her skin sent a jolt of terrifying electricity straight to her core. For a second, the heavy, unsaid thing hung between them in the suffocating heat, the sheer, gravitational pull of two minds that moved at the exact same brutal speed. Then, the grandfather clock in the main office chimed 7. The spell shattered. Gabriel dropped his hand, his jaw tightening as the mask of the commander slammed back into place. Wash your hands, Daisy, he said gruffly, stepping back. We have to draft the telegrams to Dogger Bank. November arrived not with snow, but with a relentless freezing rain that turned the cobblestones of London into slick black glass. The ministry was practically empty by midnight, save for the skeleton crew of telegraph operators in the basement. Daisy sat in the freezing archive room, wrapped in a moth-eaten ministry blanket, staring blindly at a requisition form. The door opened. Gabriel stood there, wrapped in a heavy charcoal greatcoat, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He looked wild, his eyes alight with a frantic, dangerous energy. "The Russians are moving infantry toward the Caucasus," he said, skipping any greeting. "They're going to try to bottleneck our overland supply route to the Black Sea." Daisy stood up, her cold joints popping. "We don't have topographical maps of the Caucasus Ranges. The War Office archives burned in '54. "I know, but my father didn't trust the War Office. He bought his own surveys from a Prussian mercenary 20 years ago." Gabriel turned sharply. "They are in my library at Mayfair. Get your coat. We're leaving." "Now?" Daisy balked. "It's midnight. You're—" "Gabriel, I can't go to your home. The telegraph to the Black Sea takes 14 hours. If I don't send the reroute coordinates by dawn, 3,000 men will march into a slaughterhouse. Get your coat, Daisy. I don't give a damn about propriety." 20 minutes later, Daisy was sitting in the leather-upholstered interior of a private carriage, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The scent of the carriage, rich leather and beeswax, made her feel intensely nauseous. It was the smell of a world she had no right to breathe. Gabriel's townhouse in Mayfair was not a home. It was a fortress of absurd, quiet wealth. When the heavy front doors closed behind them, shutting out the storm, the silence of the foyer was absolute. Her scuffed, waterlogged boots squeaked against the gleaming black and white marble floor. She felt intensely, violently dirty. "In here," Gabriel said, shrugging off his wet coat and tossing it to a half-asleep footman who had materialized from the shadows. He didn't even look at the servant. He led her into a massive library. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound volumes. A massive fireplace roared at the far end, throwing dancing orange light across a Persian rug that likely cost more than Daisy would earn in her entire lifetime. Gabriel went straight to a heavy oak cabinet, unlocking it with a key from his watch chain. He pulled out a massive rolled canvas map and threw it across the mahogany desk, weighing the corners down with crystal decanters. Daisy approached the desk slowly. The heat from the fire was making her shiver uncontrollably as her damp wool skirt began to thaw against her legs. "Here," Gabriel said, pushing a glass of amber liquid toward her. "Drink it. You're shaking." Daisy looked at the brandy. "I need my head clear to read the elevations." "Drink it," he commanded, his voice softening slightly. "You look like you're going to shatter." She took the glass. The crystal was heavy and cut sharply against her fingers. She took a sip. The brandy burned a fiery, beautiful path down her throat, settling into her empty stomach with a dangerous, loosening warmth. She set the glass down and leaned over the map. For an hour, there was only the scratch of her pencil and the crackle of the fire. They argued over the Darial Gorge. They calculated the marching speed of infantry through knee-deep mud. Gabriel stood right beside her, leaning his hands on the desk. Every time he shifted, his arm brushed hers. The friction was agonizing. "The artillery can't clear this ridge," Daisy murmured, pointing the blunt end of her pencil at a tight cluster of contour lines. "The grade is too steep. They'll have to detach the horses and winch the guns up by hand. It adds 2 days. "They don't have 2 days, Gabriel muttered, leaning closer to inspect the lines. His cheek was inches from hers. She could feel his breath against her temple. "They have to abandon the heavy guns." "You can't abandon the guns. The Russian cavalry will cut them to pieces in the valley." "Then find me a different pass, Daisy." "There isn't one." She turned her head, intending to glare at him, and realized exactly how close he was. The words died in her throat. Gabriel wasn't looking at the map anymore. He was looking at her mouth. The silence in the grand, opulent room became heavy, thick with the scent of rain, brandy, and a desperation that had been building for months. He looked at the bruised purple ink stain on her finger resting against the canvas map. He looked at the frayed, cheap wool of her collar, still damp from the storm. "You are destroying yourself for this," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You are fading away in that closet, living on tea and chalk dust." "I am doing my job," she whispered back, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "It shouldn't be your job," he said fiercely. He reached up, his large hands framing her face. His thumbs brushed the sharp, hollow lines of her cheekbones. The touch was completely undoing. All the cynical armor she wore, all the bitter resilience she had built against the world, fractured under the heat of his palms. "Don't!" Daisy choked out, her hands coming up to grip his wrists, intending to push him away, but her fingers curled into the fine linen of his sleeves instead, holding on tight. "Don't pity me. I couldn't bear it." "It's not pity," Gabriel rasped. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, aristocratic romance. It was a collision. Gabriel's mouth was demanding, rough with exhaustion and pent-up frustration. Daisy gasped against his lips, and then she kissed him back with a fierce, starving intensity. She dropped the pencil. Her hands slid from his wrists up to his shoulders, gripping the heavy muscles of his back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between her damp wool and his silk vest. He tasted of expensive tobacco and panic. He backed her up against the edge of the mahogany desk, his hand tangling in the messy bun at the nape of her neck, pulling the pins free until her dark hair fell in a heavy wave across her shoulders. The crystal decanters rattled violently against the wood. Daisy knew, even as she drowned in the heat of his mouth, that this was a catastrophe. She was a basement typist kissing a duke in a Mayfair mansion. Tomorrow the sun would rise, the rent would still be due, and Philip would still be coughing blood. But tonight, the war and the world outside the rain-streaked windows simply ceased to exist. There was only the map, the fire, and the ruinous, beautiful friction of his hands against her skin. The fire had burned down to fine white ash by 4 in the morning. Daisy buttoned her collar with stiff, trembling fingers. Her skin felt too tight, humming with an exhausted, bruised electricity that made her acutely aware of the rough wool scraping her throat. She didn't look at Gabriel. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the pre-dawn gray of Mayfair, a half-empty glass of brandy loose in his grip. The silence was terrible. It wasn't the charged, heavy silence of the night before. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a mistake that could not be unmade. "I will have the carriage brought round," Gabriel said. His voice was gravel, stripped of the commanding resonance he used at the ministry. He sounded as tired as she felt. "No." Daisy picked up her damp coat from the leather sofa. It smelled strongly of wet dog, and now, faintly of his tobacco. "If I arrive in a ducal crest at dawn, the typists will notice. I'll walk to the omnibus." She didn't wait for him to argue. She walked out of the library, her boots loud on the marble floor. She felt the heavy weight of his gaze on her spine, but she kept her eyes fixed on the heavy brass handle of the front door. The rain had stopped, leaving the London air tasting of worms and cold iron. By the time she reached the boarding house, the sun was a pale, sickly yellow smear behind the smog. She climbed the rotting stairs. She opened the door to their room. Philip was lying on the floor. The tin wash basin had been knocked over, soapy water soaking into the warped floorboards. Philip was curled into a tight, shivering ball, a dark spray of blood speckled across the faded wallpaper near his mouth. His breathing was a wet, horrific gurgle. "Tom!" Daisy dropped her bag. The memory of the silk-lined library vanished, instantly vaporized by the suffocating reality of poverty. She dropped to her knees, grabbing his shoulders. He was burning up. His skin felt like dry, hot paper. "Bea?" he wheezed, his eyes rolling back. Can't breathe." She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury. She grabbed the threadbare blankets from the bed, wrapping them tightly around his trembling frame. She dragged him toward the mattress, her muscles screaming in protest. "You're not going in today," she muttered, wiping the blood from his chin with her sleeve. "I'll tell Harrington the consumption has flared. I'll go alone. I'll cover it." Philip clutched her wrist with terrifying strength. "They want the Caucasus audit. Noon. I have it. It's in my head. Sleep. Chai." 2 hours later, Daisy walked into the ministry. Her stomach was a hollow, aching cavern, sour with black tea and fear. She bypassed the typist's pool entirely, keeping her head down as she climbed the grand staircase to the 4th floor. Gabriel was supposed to be in Parliament until 1 o'clock, arguing the budget for the Caucasus reroute. Daisy unlocked the heavy oak door to his office, slipped inside, and made straight for the archive room. The smell of old glue and chalk hit her like a physical blow. She locked the connecting door behind her, collapsed into the rickety wooden chair, and buried her face in her hands. She just needed to write the audit. She needed to put the numbers on paper so Philip could present them tomorrow. She picked up her pen. She dipped it in the iron gall ink. At 11:30, the brass doorknob of the archive closet rattled violently. Daisy froze. The pen hovered over the ledger. Gabriel always knocked twice on the baseboard. He never rattled the knob. "Open this door, Moore," a voice barked from the main office. It wasn't Gabriel. It was Lord Harrington. "Mr. Moore is unwell, my lord," Daisy called out, desperately trying to modulate her voice to sound calm. She shoved the ledgers under the desk. "I am organizing His Grace's files. I know Moore is not here. The front desk logged you arriving alone." A heavy fist pounded against the plaster wall. "The Admiralty Board requires the Caucasus displacement figures immediately. Open the door, or I will have the guards break it from its hinges. His Grace is hiding ministry property in a closet." Daisy stared at the door. Her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm in her throat. She looked at the slate board, covered in her aggressive masculine script. She looked at her purple-stained fingers. The game was over. She stood up. Her knees shook, but she locked them. She walked to the door, turned the brass deadbolt, and pulled it open. Harrington stood there, flanked by 2 armed ministry guards. His florid face was sweating, his eyes narrow and vicious. He looked past Daisy, expecting to see a hidden clerk, a secret telegraph machine, anything but a 22-year-old girl with chalk on her face and an unbuttoned collar. His eyes scanned the room. They hit the massive slate board. They registered the handwriting, the exact same handwriting that had been crossing his desk for 4 months. Harrington's face drained of color, then rapidly flooded with a deep, furious crimson. He looked at Daisy. He looked at the ink on her fingers. "Good God," Harrington breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "It's you. It was always you." He stepped forward, grabbing her roughly by the upper arm. His grip was bruising. "You insolent, fraudulent little bitch, you have forged ministry documents. You have lied to the Admiralty. Guards, take her to the boardroom. We're going to see exactly how His Grace explains this treason." The boardroom smelled of beeswax, stale cigars, and old men. Daisy was shoved into a heavy mahogany chair at the end of a long, polished table. 6 admirals stared at her, their faces a collective mural of aristocratic disgust. Harrington stood behind her, his breath hot on her neck. "A typist," Admiral Hastings spat, a man with a chest full of medals and a bulldog's jowls. "Whitmore is routing the Royal Navy based on the scribblings of a basement girl." "It is treason, Admiral," Harrington urged, his fingers digging bruisingly into Daisy's shoulder. "She forged her brother's name. We must arrest her immediately and invalidate the Caucasus orders." Daisy sat perfectly still. Her hands shook violently in her lap. She felt the crushing weight of centuries of institutional arrogance pressing down on her spine. But beneath the terror, looking at the Caucasus map spread across the table, her map, something cold and hard crystallized. They were going to let 3,000 men die in the freezing mud simply because of the shape of the body that did the math. The heavy double doors blew open, cracking like a gunshot against the walls. Gabriel strode in. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like a butcher. His coat was swept back, his gray eyes lethal. He saw the red marks forming on Daisy's arm. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Explain this outrage, Your Grace," Hastings barked. "Your strategy was authored by a girl." Gabriel stopped directly behind Daisy's chair. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a wall of iron at her back. "Harrington is right," Gabriel's voice was a low, vibrating rumble. Miss Moore authored the Baltic Relay. She calculated the Dogger Bank diversion. And she wrote the Caucasus audit you hold in your hands. The room erupted in shouts. "Silence!" Gabriel roared. He braced his heavy hands on the polished table, leaning over Daisy. "You gray-haired fools are debating the anatomy of the architect while the building is on fire. She isn't a typist. She is a savant. If you invalidate those orders, you kill 3,000 men by Tuesday." Hastings' face twisted in stubborn disgust. "I will not have a woman dictating War Office policy. Hand her to the constabulary. We will rewrite the orders ourselves." The knot in Daisy's chest snapped tight. She didn't look at Gabriel for permission. She stood up. The scrape of her wooden chair silenced the room. She was small, swimming in her damp wool dress, but she did not lower her eyes. "You can't rewrite them, Admiral," Daisy said. Her voice was flat, carrying no tremor. "The draft limits for the Darial Gorge vary depending on recent rainfall. The Russian artillery bottleneck requires a sequence deployment based on a specific tonnage. You don't know the tonnage." Hastings bristled. "We have the files." "The files are wrong," she said bluntly. "I burned the War Office estimates. I calculated the true drag variables myself on the floorboards of the archive room. They exist entirely in my head." She placed her hands flat on the table. Her purple-stained finger pressed against the mahogany. "Arrest me," Daisy said, locking eyes with Hastings. "Send me to Newgate, but the math goes with me. The relay dies. The ships stall. The men freeze." The silence in the boardroom became absolute. It was the suffocating quiet of powerful men cornered by a creature they didn't believe had teeth. She was blackmailing the British Empire. Gabriel stared at the side of her face. A feral, breathless smile spread across his mouth. He leaned back, crossing his arms and yielding the floor. She didn't need a shield. She was the sword. "What do you want?" Hastings managed to ask, his voice tight with trapped panic. Daisy didn't hesitate. She had shivered in the dark too long to ask for a favor. "I want a desk," she said, her voice ringing clear. "A real desk on the 4th floor. I want my brother on a full medical pension paid by the ministry. And I want the title of Senior Logistics Coordinator in my own name." "Unprecedented," Harrington scoffed. "Indecent. It's arithmetic, Harrington," Daisy replied, her gaze freezing him in place. "Do you want the coal, or do you want your pride?" Hastings looked at the map, then at Gabriel's uncompromising stare. The Admiral exhaled a long breath smelling of decay. "Give her the desk," he muttered, waving a hand in defeat. "God save us, give the girl the desk." Daisy didn't smile. She simply nodded, turned, and walked out. Gabriel caught her in the deserted, gas-lit hallway. He grabbed her arm, gently this time, and pulled her into the shadow of a marble pillar. His chest heaved as he looked at her with profound, terrifying awe. "You ruthless, brilliant creature," he whispered. "It was a man's job, Your Grace," Daisy rasped, a cynical smirk tugging her tired mouth. "Someone had to do it." Gabriel pulled her against him, crushing her mouth with his in a kiss that tasted of adrenaline and the promise of a brutal, victorious war. The ink on her fingers pressed hard into his fine coat, leaving a permanent stain. And that is how a basement typist brought the British Admiralty to its knees. Daisy didn't just win the Duke's heart. She weaponized her brilliance to carve out her own space in a world built to keep her down. A true partnership forged in fire and arithmetic. If you loved watching Daisy claim her power and outsmart the elite, hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely intelligent heroine, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional, raw historical romances. See you in the next video.